one might reasonably inquire what kind of knowledge, precisely, produces decades of silence, not ignorance. The ignorant, once enlightened, generally prove unable to contain themselves. No, the silence that Jeffrey Epstein praised in his 2011 email to Ghislaine Maxwell, calling Donald Trump the dog that hasn't barked, whilst noting a victim spent hours at my house with him, belongs to a different category entirely. It is the silence of complicity, or worse, participation. This variety of silence has its own taxonomy. It differs from the silence of the merely discreet, or the professionally bound, or even the morally compromised, who remain quiet from shame. Here, laid before us in Epstein's typo-strewn correspondence with his accomplice, is something rather more calculated: the silence of men bound together by shared criminality. In a separate communication from 2019, Epstein was even more direct, informing author Michael Wolff that Trump knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop. Stop what, precisely? Not the trafficking, merely the inconvenient practice of conducting the recruitment at premises bearing Trump's own gilded name. One might compare it to a landlord objecting to drug dealing in his building, not on principle, but because it attracts unwelcome attention to the property. The victim in question, Virginia Giuffre, took her own life this past April. She spent her final years attempting to drag into daylight what others had labored to keep in shadow, and paid for that persistence with relentless litigation, character assassination, and finally the unendurable weight of trauma that civilized societies claim, in their founding documents, to prevent. Her posthumously published memoir stands now as testimony that some truths prove fatal to tell in a world organized to protect those who purchase the privilege of committing atrocities. The 2015 correspondence between Epstein and Wolff reveals the calculus with perfect clarity. Wolff advised that if Trump were to deny traveling on Epstein's plane or visiting his properties, this would provide Epstein with valuable PR and political currency to either hang him or, should Trump's electoral prospects improve, save him, generating a debt. Here is leverage in its purest distillation. Knowledge of participation in child trafficking becomes a tradable asset, a form of insurance, a bond more binding than any legal contract. The language is transactional throughout: political currency, generating a debt, as if they were discussing stock options rather than the systematic abuse of minors. One feels obliged to pass Epstein's dual nature with care here. He was certainly a sexual predator. The testimony of victims makes that obscenely clear. But he was also, perhaps primarily, a systematic architect of compromat who understood that providing access to trafficked minors would create bonds of criminal complicity more durable than friendship or business partnership. The victims served two functions: immediate gratification for Epstein himself and long-term insurance through the implication of others. This was not opportunism, but a method. The institutional machinery grinds away with its customary opacity. Republicans immediately dismissed the document release as Democrats selectively choosing documents to generate clickbait, whilst claiming their opponents are withholding materials that name Democratic officials. The ritual is familiar. When caught, simply assert that everyone is equally guilty. If Bill Clinton spent time with Epstein, release those documents too. If Prince Andrew did, drag him before Congress in handcuffs. But this attempt at moral equalization cannot obscure the rather specific fact that one of these men currently wields executive authority, whilst his Department of Justice declines to release the full archive. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson delayed for 50 days, through 7 weeks of government shutdown, the swearing-in of Representative-elect Adelita Grijalva, whose signature would provide the necessary 218th name on a discharge petition, forcing a vote on release of the Epstein files. Johnson claimed the delay had nothing to do with that at all, which is rather like Stalin claiming the gulags were merely therapeutic retreats. Grijalva won her special election on September 23rd. She remained unsworn until this very afternoon. During that interval, over 800,000 Arizonans went without representation because their elected official might sign a piece of paper that would compel transparency about child trafficking. The casual proprietorship is perhaps most revealing. Trump himself, in July, characterized Epstein's recruitment of Giuffre from Mar-a-Lago as stealing, as if a 16-year-old employee at his resort was property to be stolen rather than a human being to be preyed upon. Giuffre's family, in their response, clarified with appropriate fury that she was not stolen, but rather targeted and preyed upon by convicted sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell. The distinction matters. One describes a dispute between employers over personnel, the other describes grooming and trafficking. That Trump cannot or will not recognize this distinction tells you rather a lot. American political discourse has perfected the art of treating child trafficking by the wealthy as merely another partisan dispute to be managed rather than a crime to be prosecuted. The Republicans accuse the Democrats of timing. The Democrats accuse the Republicans of obstruction. Meanwhile, the actual machinery of accountability, the release of documents, the compulsion of testimony, the equal application of justice regardless of power, grinds to a halt because too many people in positions of authority understand that complete transparency would prove inconvenient to themselves or their patrons. The Epstein estate has produced 23,000 documents to congressional investigators. What else resides in that archive? How many other men benefited from Epstein's understanding that participation in atrocity creates unbreakable bonds? And will those who claim to champion law and order now demand that the documents be released in full? Or will they continue manufacturing excuses about protecting victims who themselves demand transparency? The phrase keeps returning, the dog that hasn't barked. But dogs remain silent for two reasons. Either they recognize no threat, or they have been trained, through reward or punishment, that barking carries consequences. Epstein understood this perfectly. He was constructing not merely a trafficking operation, but a mutual insurance society, where each participant's guilt guaranteed every other participant's silence. The provision of victims created a kind of criminal Freemasonry, an invisible bond among men who might otherwise have nothing in common, save their participation in the unspeakable. Virginia Giuffre is dead. Prince Andrew paid her an undisclosed sum whilst admitting no wrongdoing. Ghislaine Maxwell serves 20 years in federal prison whilst asserting her innocence and requesting a pardon, and the man Epstein identified as spending hours with a trafficking victim at his home currently resides in the White House, describing the entire matter as a dead issue and a Democrat hoax. If you believe that power should be held to the same standard as powerlessness, if you credit the claim that law applies equally to all, then the release of these emails should represent the beginning rather than the conclusion of inquiry. Every document should be unsealed. Every connection should be investigated. Every participant, regardless of party or position, should face the same scrutiny that any ordinary person would face if credibly accused of knowing about systematic child trafficking. But I suspect Americans will instead do what they have done for decades, argue about process whilst ignoring substance, manufacture false equivalencies whilst avoiding genuine accountability, and ultimately decide that some crimes become permissible when committed by sufficiently important people. The dog hasn't barked because the dog was fed to keep it quiet, and those who fed it now occupy the highest positions in the land, insisting that the kennel was always empty, and anyone who suggests otherwise is simply being partisan. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps this revelation will prove to be the fulcrum that finally shifts American public discourse from performance to principle. But I've watched this particular game for long enough to recognize the pattern. The powerful protect their own. The documents stay sealed. The questions go unanswered, and the victims, like Virginia Giuffre, pay with their lives whilst their abusers pay, if at all, only in the counterfeit currency of embarrassment and inconvenience.